Shimmy, shimmy, ya, shimmy, yo, shimmy, yay. Shimmy, 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 ya, shimmy, 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 shimmy. Rest in peace, ODB. Rest in peace, Fife Dog. Yeah. Bless up. And welcome to another edition of The Heights Room. I realize that we have a soldier already in our midst here. Torian, are you live and direct? I think I seen your mouth moving, but I'm not hearing you. Your lips move, but I can't hear what you say.
Just a little delay, like them Chinese show.
All right. The
36 chamber, that's the big one.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll bring him back in a while.
Bring him back later.
Right.
Forget
We'll bring him back in a while.
he ain't know the answer to some maths question. Listen, how much coke paying you, boy? How much coke paying you?
You don't study what coke. Study what in the coke. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, you understand?
Plane just crashed with the coke.
Green tea. You understand what I'm saying? But we wouldn't specify the greens. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, cool.
That's right. You understand? So we always in heights. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. You understand? You're telling yourself, Kota.
When you say I'm slow on the uptake, you mean my brain or you mean my feed? Which one? Because
synapses now firing.
Both. All right. So welcome to another episode. As I said earlier, it is evening time. It's not night. So good evening all.
Good evening.
It is our first
early morning
episode.
for me. 9 o'clock, all the army rolling in the thing here.
You know, we said good morning, good evening, good night. Right?
Correct.
Let me do the thing right. So
that's right.
We have our guests coming on a little bit, but before we get into the guests, let's look at our hot topics for this week in the Check This segment.
The Check This segment.
Right. So the first one, the
Zessas.
Zessas.
Zessas, boy.
25 held for breach of curfew at pool party. Right. 25 persons were arrested for breach of the curfew and the public health regulations. 7:15 p.m. and 11 p.m. on between 7:15 p.m. it was conducted and 11 p.m. on Sunday, 1st August. And what we had was that they observed a large group of persons inside an inflatable pool in an open area. Hey, you can't make it up in there. You can't make it up. But like the thing, we had a big, you can't go in the beach. We had a big pool and the inflatable pool and the kind of, some of them inflatable pool, they decent, I wouldn't lie. Some of them look like they're nice bathing and thing. The officers proceeded to the apartment. A total of 25 persons, 21 to 39 years old. So,
25 people in one pool?
Well, at the apartment complex or the area, the building where the apartment
Burke Terrace, which part is that?
Burke Terrace. I find the northeast.
Yeah, that's hanging in the Digo. That's hanging in the valley.
I'm not too sure. It's the east, so it could be more by your side, let's see, I feel. While detaining the persons, one man made his escape by climbing over a wall at the compound. A warrant is to be issued for his arrest for escaping lawful custody. He get out there. He
was like, why just pulling with it?
I mean, I don't even think that was a wise choice because now he's going to get himself in actual trouble. I don't know.
What is he like? Is a fine again when they get catching them thing?
If they do go to that end to fine, it's a pretty sizable fine, if you are
really?
Outside of it's like not no 1,000 ticket and thing. It's like I can't say for sure, but it's like we said between 10 15,
it's stiff.
That kind of thing.
You're pausing
35 or kind of thing. It's about these weird fines and things that I don't know if this ever come to pass because we some big numbers, but
So the curfew's still on then. So even though things different, the curfew's still on.
No, this SOE is still on, the curfew is still on. The businesses just open up. I want to know how would they know who he is? You understand? How can you compare by So
they're looking for the man who need drugs. That's what they're looking for.
I guessing. I was hoping if they say they're really going to apprehend the man, I was guessing that after they took information is when he say out. But I mean, it's something just like a story just to get people to say, "Wait, boy." So I really
that. One man get away wetter than wet.
Yeah, he get away with and shoot.
So keeping with the whole SOE and the situation, we have the mandate for unvaccinated workers to pay for the test. So there is this talk, and I saw even the great Duke himself chiming in on this topic of the vaccination being mandatory. If it is mandatory, what will be the scene with that? So the PM said that employers have a responsibility to their staff and citizens. Prime Minister Keith Rowley says employers asking unvaccinated staff to take the vaccine or pay for PCR COVID tests on a regular basis are making decisions based on their responsibility to the population. Now, this brings up the whole question whether it is more legally, if people are within their rights. Yeah, if the state is within its right, or any private institution is within its right to tell someone that in order to be willfully employed that they need to be vaccinated. And that is a very up in the air thing, because I mean, if it's a private organization, then they would have the right, if it is their compound and so on, you know, they would have to set their rules, you know. But at the same time, then you get it into territory, I would say, like, remember people, you know, would sue employers for telling them they can't wear their hijab in work and that kind of, like, you know, there are so many things that would constitute what is the rights. Who has the rights? Is it the employer has the right? Is it the employee has the right? Is it that the human being has the right to choose whether they need to take the vaccine or not? Because clearly the vaccine is still a very hotly contested thing. I mean, all over the world, and there's no different here in Trinidad. And you know, even Mr. Duke chimed in and said that he's not anti-vax, right? Mr. Duke said he's not anti-vax, but he's not pro-vax either, and that's how the vaccines do raise a lot of questions. You know, a lot of people are coming with this angle about the emergency use, the emergency, what is call it? They were given forget the word for it. But the WHO, the WHO.
Oh, the emergency approval for
emergency approval, right? You know, emergency approval. So all that is being used, and you know, we're definitely gonna have to tack back onto this whole issue of the vaccines and do a whole episode on it. So that'll be a juicy one.
But that's still kind of funny though, boy Cutter, because you see, you can't just jump in and tell people, well, hey, the responsibility is yours, because if you think, I mean, what is governing that? What law governing that in Trinidad is the OSHA Act, you understand? And the responsibility of compliance with the OSHA Act is employers, you understand what I'm saying? So if it is your workplace not safe, you understand, which is what this fall under, that is an employer responsibility. So if it is you say, well, PCR, men have to pay for PCR tests, we understand that. And but I mean, it sounds reasonable now, you know what I mean? If it is you want to make a determination, you want to get vaccinated, well, hey, pay for your PCR test and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the OSH thing saying, well, basically, you as the employer have to ensure a safe working environment without, but you see, the untold part of that is that you have to ensure a safe working environment without infringing on our man rights. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's very, very, very tricky. You know, and these are unprecedented times, so we will see what comes out of it, because it's all very valid points and concerns when it comes to this thing. You know, because you know, Duke was saying the mantra is vaccinate to operate, and it's almost like a biblical thing they push it on. You know, Duke, you know the Duke. So I would say at this point in time, seeing that, you know, we're nearing that 15-minute marker into the show, Mr. Leslie, see that we on the topic of maths today and the mathematics of it all. right? And the mathematical model in which our good friend is coming on soon to talk about. There's a certain math problem, if you want to call it a problem, equation, right? That is making its round around the internet. It reminds me of, is it the dress black or is it dress blue? Now, whereas that is a matter of perception, right? We know maths is like 1 and 1 equal 2. It has no two ways about that.
Well,
right?
It depends on how you define 1 and how you define 2, but go ahead.
So there is a very, by all means, simple looking problem that is making its rounds, but a lot of people are quarreling over it. Let's see it. Let's see this thing.
Look the problem.
So 8 divided by 2, open brackets, 2 plus 2, close brackets, equal. Let me hear in the chat. That's how maths went up in the chat. Quick maths. So I as a man is not the maths man. Never was, never will be. Right? I the language man, the theater man, not the maths man. Right? But from what I would have had drilled in my head, there was the bod mass or maybe
make fire proud.
Right? So I would say first of all, inside the bracket is 4, right?
Right.
And 2 by 2 is 4 is 2. So 8 divided by 2.
Write it down.
That's all I can calculate.
Yeah, I think so. In a mess. Maybe we should really bring in the maths, man.
I go say is 16.
How you get 16?
8 divided by 2. Well, okay, 2 plus 2.
You do 2 into 8, 4, and then 4 by 4. From
2 plus 2 is 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. Right? So any bracket is 4.
That's not matching. Yes, Fiola. Let him know. You're good.
Actually, I would say is 8 divided. Okay, I would say 2 plus 2 is 4. 2, and then I'll do the 2 by the 4 and get 8, and 8 divided by 1. I get 1.
Okay, right. So you get 1 because everybody teach you about mass and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
You understand? Well, boy, the word on the ground. The word on the ground, fellas, is that the answer is 16, eh? You understand what I'm saying? That's the word on the ground. You understand?
So what would be the reasoning for that?
Well, what was your reasoning for coming up with that? Your reasoning was mass.
Well, because I study maths, man, I was seeing 2 things happening one time in my brain now. But, I would have said that first of all, you add what's in the bracket, right?
Right.
And you will get the
I'll bring it back up.
The 4.
I was in the bracket. Yeah. You get the 4.
Then I would have multiplied. I would have looked to multiply the bracket one time. I don't know why that roll. That's the
right.
It's a 2 by 4, 8, and then 8 divided by 8, 1. That's what I would have looked to do.
Right. Well, the thing is that the to be honest, fellas, the answer doesn't seem to be simple. You understand what I'm saying? So everybody would jump on it and say either BODMAS, BOMDAS, and then there's a new one, BEMDAS, and then there's PEDMAS. You understand what I'm saying? So the reality is that the actual answer seems to be 16. You understand? And it has to do.
It's either 1 or 16. I could say that's why I say 16 because in the moment I see 16. But how it could be,
right? So
one alone. It could be either one.
So right. Well, no, it can't be 1. It can't be 1. So what it is, we thought. You understand what I'm saying? You see, we's part of a colonial empire now, boy. You understand? So we just do what we told. You understand what I'm saying? But the problem is what we told. And what we told is BODMAS or BOMDAS and all this thing and whatnot. But the reality is what people don't know is the BOMDAS and whatever is acronyms. They are not the actual rules that govern. You understand? You actually have 4 rules. And from those 4 rules, they develop these acronyms. But those acronyms are not universally applicable. You understand what I'm saying? So bring back up the question there, Torian.
No problem.
You have the first rule is brackets first. That's the first rule.
Well,
when you have multiple brackets, you basically go from the inner brackets to the outer brackets. That's the first rule, right? So you get your 4 inside of there, right? So you're starting there. right? Your next thing is
This is the trick now.
This is the trick now. Right. The trick now is the next part is powers, roots, and fractions. You understand what I'm saying? That is your second rule. You had to deal with the second rule there first. You understand? So the second rule now, you deal with your numerators and whatnot and thing. And then so if you have indices, if you have exponents, you have to deal with that first. So then you
have
do
that in this?
Yeah, well, you do A divided by 2.
Oh, because that is the one thing outside the bracket.
Correct. Well, is powers, roots, and fractions is a fraction. You understand what I'm saying?
Okay.
A divided by 2 is 4. You see where we're going?
So you had to get the 4 by 4 then.
Right. And then after that, now you have your multiplication and division. Multiplication and division are inverse operations and must be treated equally. So you see people that think Bodmas or Bomnas, and one man say Bomnas and one man say Bodmas, and one man feel he should get a trophy. Both of them, you really is not correct. You understand what I'm saying? What it is that they must, because they are inverse operations, they must be treated equally, and you must work from left to right. You understand what I'm saying? That is the rule. That's the third rule. You understand what I'm saying? So then now you would have 4 multiplied by 4, and you're working left to right. You understand what I'm saying? And then the last one is addition and subtraction, and you're going from left to right as well. You understand what I'm saying? Right. And that's how you get the 16 fellas. You understand what I'm saying? No. You understand? That's a good question.
I want to check it in a while.
You could do it on Google?
Well, I'm going to try because just start copy and paste it or something. So at this point in time, to clear up the air on this 16, right? Because
8 divided by 2 into
so
2
1 or 16 depends on how you look at it. Numbers not real anyway, Bisham saying.
Google gave you 16. Google gave you 16.
Numbers not real anyway,
right, so I would like to bring on now a man who would like not very much not like to hear that numbers ain't real, because then he ain't real, right? And this is
figment of the imagination.
None other than our brethren up there in the UK. The reason why we have to do it earlier, because we have to get this guy on the show, and this is Kris Parag. Kris, how you doing there, buddy?
Yeah, good man. Just listening to all, deal with what
you're listening to the mathematical minds here. No, Kris is a research fellow at the Imperial College in England, and this is where he attempts to model epidemics such as COVID-19, Ebola, SARS, and so on, right? So he's a mathematician, a mathematical modeler, and if you want to know what importance that is, when you see Dr. Avery Hines and these kind of people on TV, the epidemiologists, and they are talking, it is the data and the work of mathematicians such as Kris that feed their theories, their concepts, and so on. So, Kris, how you doing, brother? Let's kick things off with a little insight on what you thought about the problem, just to kick things off on a little light mode before we get into the real heights of what we see in there.
Well, it's real light for me. I think the problem is nonsense. I mean, I think no. I hear what Lassie's saying, and I think he's probably right. But what I think is that it's more a question of communication, because if you can read a statement like that and come with 2 answers, then something.
Then we have a problem.
The question was badly done.
It's incomplete. It's incomplete.
Yeah,
because
that makes sense actually.
Just to finish up, like as Shambir Bisham write it down there. If you replace that division sign with the the fractional,
correct, across the board, it'll be different.
Yeah, then it'll look like 8 divided by everything that follows, and you tend to do the thing at the bottom and then the thing at the top, and you'll get 1. So
yes,
I don't even know who does use division sign, to be honest. Like, I think that has disappeared after primary school, but.
Right.
So men doing it for the lols then, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fine.
They get plenty.
It's good fun. I just
it's the vagary of it all, I mean, that's what they're really trying to.
Well, it is, right? Like if somebody code that up and they code it, I tell you that, and you code it up some way, and I code it up another way, and we both get different answers. That's kind of the thing that at some point,
communication.
the US and Europe was collaborating on some space shuttle, and one of them decided to use metric, and one of them decided to use, and they didn't talk to each other, and it caused the thing to crash. So I mean, it's more communication than
right. And you see, and there you have it, folks.
Yeah,
just go.
You can't take it in isolation. That is just numbers.
Just go with the English system and done the talk. All right. So let's see. Probably you could start us off with the deliberations of today's episode.
Yeah, well, Jed, the thing about it is that Kris, boy, we appreciate you coming on. We know the time not easy. And, this is not an easy topic to unpack. Many people I talk to kind of see where's the scene and that kind of thing. Men go talk, but men ain't really know. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And, when you're reading on Google, it could only carry you so far. But it's really, for people to really understand the hindsight is to understand, well, the spread of something has mathematical roots. You understand what I'm saying? And I mean, in unpacking the discussion, is really to understand the nature of epidemics, that people talking about, the COVID and how it's spreading and this kind of thing, vaccinations, how it affecting that and whatnot and thing, not understanding that behind the scenes, there's all of this data that is being developed that is a reliable scientific tool to help in the fight against COVID. But that tool has to be, measured with, the proper science. And in this case, we're going to delve into the proper maths to really unpack accurately what is exactly happening. So, I mean, the first thing that I think people want to understand is really the history behind modeling of an epidemic. I mean, when you just do a basic reasoning, they say it starts around the Spanish flu time. Some people say it starts around the bubonic plague time. And it has to do with all predicting the course of a disease. Is that correct? What's the history behind modeling an epidemic?
So, probably before that, it might be good to say what a model is, which is that...
Correct.
Is effectively... some sort of, it don't have to be, but it's potentially a sort of computational tool. And you put into that tool what you believe are certain assumptions behind spread, certain bits of data that you collected. And then you try to run that tool, across time, potentially predict what might happen into the future, or try and better understand what has been happening up until now. So usually when you use models, that's kind of what you want to do. You want to either have a little forecast, something similar to a weather forecast, but not quite like that, or have a view of can I better understand what happened up until now, right? And that's sorry.
And for the layman, Kris, just not didn't mean to cut you off, but for the layman, when you say a tool, right, in its simplest form, what do you mean by this tool?
Right. Yeah. So I guess by a tool, I was just thinking like a piece of software, for example, in the more modern terms. But when it started off, which now we'll get to Leslie's point, which was actually around the 1920s, you could say, so about 100 years ago, which is also roughly around the Spanish flu, a little bit after the Spanish flu time. It wouldn't necessarily be it wouldn't be software then, but it would have been. You might remember this from school. People would see it on Twitter, on Facebook. People shouting like, what is the use of things like derivatives, y equal mx plus c and all of this. But like that is literally what it is. It was a bunch of derivatives, like differential equations. So that's I don't know. I think how familiar people are, but it's effectively just a concept of you're describing a rate of change and you want to push that forward in time. So that is your model. Your model is you'll call that a dynamical process because it changes with time. So it's some dynamical process that you've written down, probably with calculus from the days of CXC or CSEC or whatever.
Right.
And you could understand it with the stuff from CXC and CSEC as well. So this is sort of like the original, and why it came to prominence was around the 1920s. There was a guy called Ronald Ross. And he worked with a couple other physicians as well. I think Hamer or something was one of the other famous ones. And what they did that was new and novel at that period of time was they used some of these, this sort of calculus techniques, these derivatives and so on, to say, well, what could I learn about malaria? Because malaria was a big deal. Well, that was their specific. And what this guy came up with was that he wrote down his equation, so how he thought spread might occur, which was to have two elements, you could say, a group of people who can be infected, so you call them susceptible. You could call them vulnerable. They usually use susceptible, and a group of people who are infected, and then you try to understand how they mix, right? And his original models, he was using it to try and understand the relationship between populations of humans and populations of mosquitoes. And his big sort of contribution there was to say, well, actually, if you reduce the mosquito population below some threshold, malaria in that region would eventually die out. And that was like a big deal. And he eventually won a Nobel Prize for that and other related to malaria. But that was kind of like so this what they have is these guys, what they're doing is they're taking their empirical observations and they're trying to put that down into some degree of equations or mathematics, and then use that to then draw insights, because that is, as Leslie would say, is a form of reasoning or reasonings.
That kind of heights.
Oh yeah. And it could go wrong depending on what, because the thing is, so people talk about models like it's something different, but every day you're using a model implicitly. If you're deciding to cross a road, you have some model in your head, and when you think the car will reach close to you, so you have a inherent.
That's a good way to break it down.
And where it's going to be next, and so on. So you're always using models. Everything you learn in school, physics, chemistry, all that stuff is all models. What
about for them who went behind the school?
Yeah. Yeah. And so as I say, so when you come to that, it ends up boiling down to a mixture between what assumptions you want to put in, and what equations you then want to use to carry those assumptions forward to get to some conclusions. And you want to hope that you don't end up in a situation where your conclusions are too dependent on your assumptions. So just to bring that back to kind of reality, what I meant by that was that so in there was another case where they had plague in a town in Sheffield. So in that case, that a model in the head that a model that, well, look, rats spreading this, we're going to quarantine, keep the village under lock, conserve resources. There was a bit of conflict as to what the sort of, it was a rector or like a religious person who mandated this in the village, and there was a bit of contradictory about what he thought about, what was his intentions. But what happened is they did quarantine, they did stop the spread further, but they actually increased their death toll inside because they didn't realize how important human to human spread is. So that was a case where there wasn't mathematical modeling there, but that was a case where the assumptions led to some unexpected conclusions. So kind of like, so the history the history is just simply trying to bring your assumptions up into a framework where you could more explicitly look at how they relate to your conclusions.
Right. But I mean, one question though, Kris. I mean, if you're looking at it from that perspective, I mean, a little later on in the discussion, we're gonna bring in like environmental factors and whatnot, and how that relates to improving the accuracy of a model and that kind of thing. But I want to hone in specifically on this guy Ross that you mentioned, right? Now, from what I understand, he was the guy who basically brought on evolutionary thinking in how you go about mathematically modeling epidemiology by bringing about the compartmental model. And that compartmental model would have basically been a progression on some work from John Grant in the earlys, which was estimates of comparative risks, where he developed something called the theory of competing risks. Now, in this evolution, in this sort of evolutionary, perspective on developing what people now use in the modern era as this is how you approach modeling. From what you were describing, that change is basically on a temporal scale. How then did they approach modeling on a spatial scale? Because for me, that is more challenging to know, well, if this was the center, because I was reading a case of John Snow, who seemed to be one of the first guys who would have studied pattern of cholera cases in 1855. And he was the guy who located the Broad Street water pump as the source of an infection for cholera. And it was kind of like the beginnings of that spatial understanding of the model. Is it how do you begin to go about modeling something like that?
Right. So that's a great question and highly pertinent. To finish off, where you mentioned about John Snow, that's a tourist attraction now. You can visit the pump.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, effectively, just to give our background, he's considered the father of epidemiology as a whole. And what he did was he tracked the cases of cholera, and he made a map, and he showed that if you follow this map, you just kind of lead to a source, and the source was this water well or whatever, and he believed that it was infected, so something infected there, and that just kicked off the whole thing. And as I said, there's a huge spatial component, but it's probably worth first just explaining what a compartmental model is.
Right. Yes.
Just also because it's the most predominant and important way to think about an epidemic. As in, the basis of that still comes out from the 1920s, but it's still used today, explicitly for COVID even. So the idea is you place, that three of you guys here, so it's perfect to actually explain. So it's how I see the three of you in three boxes, right? You think of a population as being in three boxes. And like we say, Torian is an infected person. Kata is somebody who could get infected, so he's susceptible. And Lassie is a man who recovered because, well, we don't know why.
The greens.
And all this model says is if Kata and Torian bounce into each other, Kata Torian might transmit to Kata, right? There'll be some probability. Yeah, like that. Exactly that. Right? And then Kata might get sick. Or Torian might go into Leslie's box because after he feel ill for a while, he'll recover, right?
Right.
Probably worth saying in this model, recovery also includes the idea of death. So if you die, you're also considered recovered.
That's true. You ain't spreading nothing.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah, because you're not
right.
Exactly. So this simple idea is, people hit into each other, they transmit. After a while, they recover, right? And that is called the SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered. And that is the basis of most models.
Most models.
In total. And that and to sort of just to bring it back to things you might have learned in school, the actual, the idea, say Kata bumping into Torian is you would model that as some sort of random process. It's actually the same as how you model a chemical reaction. So in a chemical reaction, you might have sodium having to collide with a chlorine, a chloride atom, and sodium. So and you have to have them to collide to then eventually produce, well, I guess a Lessie in this case, but that's
brownie and ocean.
That simple dynamic, which they call mass action, right? Is behind all of that. So that's the compartmental model. And as you correctly say, there's some, as I mentioned before, whenever you're doing any of these things, you have to really think about what assumptions are being put in, right? And this doesn't just apply to models, because it applies to any of these computational programs or techniques you're using. It's a big thing now in artificial intelligence, for example, as I think.
Right.
So assumptions and biases, and in this case, the biggest assumption is I assume that Qatar and Tehran could just bounce into each other, like, with no constraints, right? But in reality, I mean, Qatar living in Trinidad and Tehran living in Canada, they're not going to bounce into each other, right? So that model is crap. So you had to start thinking spatially, right? So spatially, you would say your first route is to take that same idea and just split it up into different countries and then have them interact every once in a while. So split it up so Torian could bounce into other Canadians and get sick or transmit. Qatar could bounce into other Trinidad and get sick. And then every once in a while, somebody could take a flight from one place to the other and allow the possibility of infections between the two regions as well.
Right.
And that introduces a spatial structure.
Now you're saying something, Kris. You're saying that how the assumptions are paramount to what is being, going to be the outcome, what we're looking for. You have to be very careful as to what is being assumed. Seeing that you have been doing this with, COVID, and COVID is, the reality we are living right now. Would you say that over your recent studies and modeling, that when it comes to the assumptions being used when modeling for COVID, that because of the challenges that COVID has thrown towards the world and by extension the scientific world, that would you be able to tell us if there were any kind of assumptions about COVID that would have had to been challenged in the process of its development and, in the saga of dealing with COVID and trying to model,
Yeah, they had some key ones. So some of them, they're not so much, they're not so much necessarily that someone came with a bias, but what happened was someone started to say, estimate a parameter. It probably would explain what parameter is here and particularly what. So in these models, as I mentioned, there might be, some sort of equations running through. They usually have these variables in those equations, right? And some of them you put values to, and some of them you would want to find out. So one day you want to find out the same number of infected, right? So that's a variable you wouldn't put a value to. That's something you want to know about. But you might put a value to how many people someone infects on average, right? You might have this parameter, and that's the R number, which is the most famous. If you watch Contagion and so on, you'll hear about the reproduction number, R0, R, whatever you want to call it. And that idea is just simply that I want to know how many people someone will infect on average during for the duration of which they're infectious, right?
Right.
And it's a simple idea, but it's extremely important. And what happened is when COVID or SARS-CoV-2 emerged, it was a lot of heat to try and get this parameter out early because it would be useful. If the number is large, right, it would change potentially how you would respond to this disease. So as an example, you could have a small. Well, there's two numbers. There's that, and also there's the rate of death given infection. So these are probably the two key parameters, right? Now, if the rate of death given infection is high, then like Ebola, which is like 50%, then you're like, that's it.
Yeah, it stifles the spread because
it stifles the spread, but you will die. And if the R number is large, then one person choosing to, for example, say not get vaccinated and open up to potential infections could cause a large number of infections. And this is the case with measles. So measles has a very high R number. I think something around 14 or something like that.
40?
14.
Okay.
14.
Yeah.
So as you're kind of
wait, so COVID has how much? COVID has how much?
Three.
Okay,
so,
average.
Question to just slightly not off topic, but I say measles has 14, COVID has R. Does that R number, 3, does that R number vary from variant to variant within COVID?
Yes.
What?
So this will nicely circle back to Leslie's question about spatial, but I'll just address one other thing before that. When you're asking about the biases, so what happened is people wanted to work out this R number. They used a various set of techniques, but they got a number of different values. Some people thought it was 6, some people thought it was 2. And, so when they say 6, people will get scared. If you don't actually see that reality, then people will say, well, the science is not working. Right. But that is not the case. The science was working. What was happening was that every model had different biases, right? The person who has 6 probably put some, because it was early in the pandemic, they probably used some parameters going back to that from another related, in this case, they probably used SARS, right? Because it was similar. And the what you would tend to do then is what you should do is you should have all these different models and try to sort of average and interpret across all of them to try and minimize your risk to any specific assumption. So in the beginning, this R number was a source of bias. Now I think it's resolved, but this was the question. Circling back to Torian, who was asking, so the R. So when people have been talking about variants of concern, right? One of the things about them is that they have an R number that's potentially double, 50% to double, 50 to 100% higher than the previous, the sort of, you want to call the original variant, alpha or whatever.
Yeah, the alpha.
So that was one of the key things so when someone says like, oh, this variant is more infectious or more transmissible, they're often talking about the R number being higher in that variant.
Than a previous variant or
original
variant.
In the UK, how that kind of manifested itself was that we were in lockdown and the curve was going down, and we were still in lockdown, and then it started to go up. And then I was like, well, what really going on here? And then they checked that intensive sequencing programs, and they said, well, actually, it's a new variant, and it's about twice as transmissible as before. So
that is what caused that. That's very interesting. So that's why it's sometimes so difficult for governments and to react sometimes to these things, because they're not looking for these things initially. It's only after it's more reactive than proactive, so to speak.
Something else is that usually you won't see it because the data collection level on COVID has been unprecedented compared to previous epidemics. So, if you want to say, like, I think in the UK they were doing like they were sequencing thousands of people every week potentially, right? If you look back to like say 5-10 years ago, you'll see that people were trying to make inferences with something like 5 sequences, 5 sequences versus thousands now. That's like the level of change.
Right. Sorry, go ahead, Leslie. Go ahead.
So just to see if I could understand this correctly, Kris. So we've gotten to the point where we understand that the compartmental model is like the base on which you approach, all this, moving the evolution of the models itself. And you now talk about the reproduction number, which changes depending on, the variance and this kind of thing. If it is we look at it from a temporal perspective, is it that all these models basically assume a sort of decay from to basically get to the end? So if you're predicting like a forecast model, then are they like forecast models where they carry you to the point of where you reach either endemic equilibrium or disease-free equilibrium? How does that last part of the model sort of work out?
Yeah. So what happens is, if you go back to the compartmental model, as you were saying, right? Remember, I said we had a bunch of cutters interacting with a bunch of Torians, and maybe Torian was infecting cutter, and so on, right? But in reality, we only have a finite number of cutters and a finite number of Torians, right? So you could only infect. You'll just run out of people to infect. Basically, you'll run out of new cutters to infect. Right? You hit this kind of, threshold where the epidemic has burnt out all its resources because it run out of fuel, if you want to call it that, right? And some model, I don't know if to try and make that clear, all it means is that if when people people talk a lot about herd immunity. This will feed in very nicely to that. People talk a lot about herd immunity, right? What they're trying to say is that you vaccinated so many people that those people are now in the recovered class rather than in the susceptible class. So I vaccinated a ton of cutters and I put them in the lessee box, right? And have only a few cutters to infect. So even if he does his very best and he worked really hard to infect everyone, he only infect about 5 people, say.
Because that number is so small now.
And then if you plot that out in the epidemic, then what you'll see is that infections will keep going up until they run out of people, and then they'll start to come back down. So that's kind of the,
So that's the whole flattening the curve that everybody was.
That's the whole flattening the curve. But if you go back to your other point, where you was asking spatial differences. Spatial differences mean that model might not be true. So what we think that threshold is might not be true, because what could happen is, as I said before, actually Torian had to take a flight to infect Cutter, so it'll make it very unlikely for him to do so. So you wouldn't have to think about it in quite those terms. You might just instead have, some small pools of people who could infect each other, and they burn out their pools on their own, rather than expanding across the world. So you could have differences on those sort of thresholds. So that's a big area of debate at the moment.
But then so as you talk about debate, because normal, and I just comparing it to models like what we would use in engineering to model like wave forcing on eroding coastlines and that kind of thing. One of the things that you do is always to validate and verify a model with existing data sets in order to calibrate the model to get it correct. But by getting it correct, it still isn't true, especially when you forecast it, because there's a lot of different parameters that are involved. In a case like that, these model biases then tends to come in, and there are a series of gaps then that show themselves. And I remember reading about some stuff called the missing models. Could you just explain a little more about that in terms of how that relates to the actual science of it?
Yeah, so I guess what you're basically asking is how realistic are models?
Yes.
How realistic? And the question, the answer to that is, well, they have two answers. There are two ways to look at it. One way is I will go and track, every Torian and every Cutter, maybe with their mobile phone, learn their movements, try to describe spread that way, right? Almost like from the ground up, right?
Right.
And that may sound more accurate, and it might be more accurate in some situations, but it depends on the quality of data at such a fine scale, right? So that will resolve into a very complicated model with lots of parameters and variables, which, as you asked about, would be harder to validate. It's harder to validate something like that. This sort of simpler compartmental case has fewer parameters, so it's easier to check on them, but then they don't have that level of complexity. So if you go to your engineering models, when you're saying is, you have this thing called a toy model, which just has the very basics.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, a toy model is the very basics, which you hope could give you a general insight, and then you have sort of the more complicated thing where I decided to put every bit of knowledge I have, right? The deciding between the two will again boil down to data versus assumptions. In the small model, we made some more assumptions, but our data is probably more robust to having those few things we want to check, right? R numbers or whatever. In the big model, where we're tracking people's movements, we made less assumptions, but we might not have the data to really constrain those different parameters. So this is I don't know if how clear that is.
So it's almost like a race then, Kris, in that as time passes, your data sets get better and you're able to make less assumptions. So your models get more realistic. However, you can't wait indefinitely, because the earlier you get a model is the more you're able to intervene. So it's sort of a kind of trade-off then that sort of happens. But then in a case like that, Kris, so let's say like COVID, right? I mean, we're operating since 2019. And, I mean, researchers have been doing basically a Herculean task to be able to try and keep, as the infections go in, updating these models and that kind of thing. Over right now, this in the end, middle of 2021, how much data that data set, which is like about a year and a half or so, how does that fuel into our model? Like how is that a good data set then to give a realistic model, or is it usually better to like operate more on a 3-year or a 5-year model?
So actually both. So in some sense, so for flu, for example, where we've had years and years of data, people have found that recent study, well, not recent, I guess it was just before the pandemic, I showed that if you take those 10 years of data and you start to really carefully look at all the differences, calibrate your models, as you said, to them, and then try to do forecasting, you get something much more, if you want to say risk averse, so less likely to produce incorrect predictions, right?
Right.
Now, COVID, we don't have that. You want to move, that kind of back testing thing is not for real time. That is for like, we want to develop a system that maybe in the future we could benefit from, but we dependent on a huge quantity of past data. For COVID, we didn't have much data on COVID when it came out. There is much more now. So what people do is they started their models with the early versions of the parameters. Then as more data came in, they updated those estimates to try and keep it sort of on the level. So for example, when the new variants started to dominate, they changed the R number in the models, for example, right? Because it wouldn't be characterized. So in that sense, the flu stuff is a good example of this long-term approach that could potentially lead better, also long-term gains, right, in future. But for this thing, as you said, where you want to be fast, you probably want to start off with simpler models, and then as more data comes in, you keep updating them. Sort of like how you should actually, that's how you should actually live life, like effectively. And as more data come in, update your opinion with time.
And change.
Right.
So you gotta hope you update with the right things,
Right.
Exactly.
That's the key. That we see what's going on there now.
As I said, and now the situation with COVID is that in some of the like third world countries, it basically had they had some issues with their data. There were more biases in their data. So fitting to their data actually then propagated the biases to the models. So how you create data, like, it's not just their fault, it's just lack of resources because surveillance is expensive. So underreporting, for example, of say deaths. Like I think they said in like Syria, Syria is one of the worst stuff, right? But in Syria, I think it was like 10% of the COVID deaths were actually reported. If you try to work with that, you get a really strange view of what the epidemic is.
Of what the situation is.
Right. But as you mentioned that, I mean, nothing is as good as, talking about actual cases and the actual application of these things. So going into actual applications of these models, one in particular that seemed to pique my interest was one on the SARS virus, where it illustrated a long-range spatial distribution and assessed like heterogeneous mixing and this sort of thing. I don't know if you could talk a bit about your experiences with actual models and research that would have been done specifically on SARS that sort of illustrates that sort of long-range spatial sort of scenario.
Well, so what's happened there is that, if you go back to the analogy with, the compartmental models, and I was saying people could mix sort of, cutters and Taurians are just in two boxes mixing with each other at random. Since that is not realistic for SARS, what happens is you have a lot of super spreading events, which is also true for COVID as well. And that is what you mean by heterogeneous mixing to an extent. So what it means is that, you know, even though R might be 2, right, on average, you know, one taurin will infect 2 cutters. Some taurians might infect 10 cutters.
Right,
you know?
right. So it's a bit of...
Go on.
Yeah, so it's a bit of almost reverse engineering then, that as the data comes up, you're able to then build a equation or coding that then fits the behavior. So it's like as the empirical data comes up, it allows you to then determine, well, this is the reality. So then your mathematical model then needs to be able to fit this case, understanding the physical parameters around it.
Yeah, so this is where like good surveillance came in. So with SARS, particularly, I think Hong Kong, some of the other East Asian countries, they had very good, you know, first of all, they had populations that were very compliant in terms of the measures they took, and they were very good at identifying cases. SARS also had the advantage that the symptoms were a bit clearer. COVID has the disadvantage that a lot of people may not have symptoms and still be spreading.
Asymptomatic, right?
Really, yeah. So that made it easier to be able to track how the infection was actually happening, say even on a small scale, and then you could sort of take the ideas from that and build into the model. And one of the ideas was this heterogeneity, as you're talking about, super spreading. And a good example of a real case where that happened was with SARS. They traced back one sort of cluster. People just being in an elevator with one infected person. So like 8 other people were in that elevator. I don't know, maybe he breathed out, coughed, whatever. It was long enough that you got like this like spread, like 1 to 8, you know, 1 person to 8 other. So that's a good example of that sort of scenario. If you look at using the genetic data, you try to trace back sort of the tree of how transmission occurs with COVID too, as well as you'd also find these heterogeneous clusters. So these clusters where a few people had like an outsized effect on how like, you know, it's exactly the same as being in Facebook. Like a few popular people on Facebook have a lot of connections. They said something, that message will pass on very quickly.
10 times more.
You know? Right. So those are the super spreaders on Facebook. Is the same as the idea, and a lot of the maths is the same too between the two. So
right. So then something like that, where these information and parameters that would have emerged from these SARS studies. I know you also spent some time researching the Ebola virus as well. What was some of the unique sort of circumstances surrounding that model and spread? Is it that it's actually spread faster with Ebola than COVID, or was Ebola just more deadly?
So Ebola is more deadly. What's interesting about Ebola and what caused like a big fuss around the time? So you might have heard the term exponential growth going around a lot in COVID.
Yeah.
Right? Which is just all it describes in simple terms is a multiplicative process. So, you know, if we go back to this R number, you know, 1 taurin infects 2 cutters who then infect, you know, 4 more, 2 each, you know, other people or lessees or whatever. And you continue that process. And if you count the number of infections, it will look like something that goes, you know, exponentially up. That's the exponential growth, right? And what many models would do is they would fit to that sort of curve and then project forward in time, right? And say something like we're going to have 200,000 infections or something with some big number, because that's exponential growth grows very rapidly. So you get these big numbers. Then that didn't happen in reality, and people said, well, the models must be rubbish. It's not the case.
Right.
What happened was, you know, the models were correct according to their assumptions, but some of the assumptions weren't right. And in the case of Ebola, it had what they called sub-exponential growth, which was due to the spatial pattern of how it was spread. So, however, it was specifically spread spatially. It didn't have this exponential characteristic. It had a sort of more between linear and exponential. So they called it exponential, and that changed that change your predictions by a lot. So that was an issue and a difference with Ebola. And there's a lot of modeling. We hear about certain diseases, but there's like a ton things that we don't hear about, or things that you forget, like HIV, for example.
Right.
And there are all of these things as well, but each disease has all these different characteristics, so you'd have to put them in your model. So COVID, you might have heard people talking about an incubation period of, say, about 5 days. Right?
Right.
Yeah. The HIV incubation period is years. So if you want to make a model for that.
Kris, I just wanna touch on something. I'm not sure if we explained it, but I know Leslie brought it up in the inception of the show. When we say spatially, right?
Yeah.
When we say spatial, what exactly can we define that as for anybody who's not sure what it means?
Sure. So we could think about it like even just from top level down, right? So we might run our model at a countrywide level. So we sum up all the infections across the whole country, and we try to make predictions about that. That might be inaccurate, but it'll probably give you like a good first guess, right? But if you can see data by regions, right, then you can start looking. So each region is a spatial grid or component, if you want to call it that. So you would then run your model with some knowledge of, say, the different amounts of infections in each region, if you want to call it that. So, for example, you would find that cities would have clusters of a lot more infections than rural areas where people are further apart and also less populous, less dense. Right. So that is a spatial difference that you would miss if you just looked at the population as like the whole.
So spatial has to do with geographic and different regions and so on. Okay.
Yeah.
I hear you.
But then in a case like that, then Kris, is it then that because I understood a lot of these models to be done off of like MATLAB and those sort of softwares, but then from what Kotta is describing, there's then room for basically building an actual computerized model of the physical. So if you do like a region wide, let's say of London, right? Then isn't there potential to then marry like these actual mathematical models with like a ArcGIS model of the city itself to say on a planar scale, well, this is how it's going to spread. And like as it spreads, because those ArcGIS models tells you like what is the material on the street, what height of buildings that you have, whether it's rural, whether it's rivers, whatnot. All of those parameters are built into this 3D model of this is your physical space. Can those models then be superimposed on that as another layer?
Yeah, they could, but again, you'll hit this problem of complexity. If you start to look at, so you could look at as you basically asking the individual level scale, right? The movements of an individual through, I don't know, a city to workplaces, this kind of stuff, and you could definitely do that. You don't need to necessarily impose it on these like engineering structures. You could people have been doing it using mobile phone tracking, for example.
You could
literally get an idea of how mobile a population is, how many contacts someone has on average, and you could get some good. And that's sort of like one of the new, sort of more modern techniques that has come out in the last few years, where they've tried. It also has its own problem with different biases. So, for example, if you use the mobile phones, you'll more likely get knowledge of younger populations than older populations. Which might, bias.
Let's see. You just take it for granted. Everybody know all these technical things just come with GIS and ways,
everybody know Arsenal they winning no Champions League. Tell fake who I say that.
Geographic information system. But
I don't know. So that is me trying to. Yeah, that's me trying to merge the models that I am aware of in engineering, so that if it is we're designing like bridges or roadways and whatnot, the easiest way to actually determine the existing space that you're superimposing it on is to get existing GIS data sets on that specific area. So like if Kris is describing like how, so let's take London for example, right? And we're talking about how COVID spreads, and you develop a spatial model for that. It may say something like on First Street, you would basically have on day one, the infection is going to go from this part to this part of First Street, and after 12 days, it'll cover the entire street. Then it'll do the same thing on 84th Street. But remember, if you look at that on a spatial, on from a planar standpoint, you're looking down from the top like a map, it will then change based on the physical parameters of those streets. And if it is some of those streets interrupted by a river, that will then have other parameters. If you have a lot of forest in that area, and I'll tell you how relevant it is what Fayola is asking there is now. So there's an article that we saw that actually is talking about the interaction between climate change models and these epidemiological models. And just as how you model, from what I understand it, just as how people model climate change in the future, taking all these physical parameters into account, so you're talking environmental factors, this same GIS concept sort of implies that. So that's where I was going with the question. The next question was, how does these physical parameters, is it you as a modeler, Kris, manually going on a Google map and saying, well, it are trees there, so I put on a number 3 in my MATLAB model, or is there something whereby they could literally interact with these more physical parameter models like what is in climate change modeling to make your job easier?
So some people do this. So I think you could get this data, for example, on aircraft movements, right? On all the flights that went out, when they went out, and so on. And I know there is a group, a sort of a subsection of modeling that they're more into like tracking the variants and so on, right? The sequencing. And they would tend to marry this sort of like the sequence data they collect with this flight data to try and determine, for example, if airflow in a certain region might have led to a lot more, infections being transmitted into that region from outside.
Right.
Kind of about, potential rises in infection. So there is definitely that. So there is definitely a link.
Some
there.
Interaction in those things.
On the climate side, I think that is the future of where this will. Well, two things: climate and behavior will be the future of where this stuff will need to sort of to go. Because when I was describing simple models, where I was saying like Torian and Cutter just bouncing into each other, potentially transmitting infection, I never account for the fact that maybe Torian and Cutter hate each other and will never get close to each other, for example, right?
Right.
Like just
behavior,
a simple, a pretend example, but the behavioral impact of things, also directly influences your ability to control it. Because what could happen is, like with vaccines, you put out your best idea to try and get people vaccinated. They perceive it as the vaccine being more risk than the actual disease itself. They refuse to get it, and then now you have to account for this sort of feedback, into your model. So if you then take that and then add on top of that the fact that some things just become worse with climate change, short term or long term. So, for example, short term, say you have floods happening more often, you'll get these outbreaks either from people congregating together or from waterborne diseases or whatever. So you have these other influences, these climate-based influences. But perhaps the most famous climate example is just the winter-summer sort of, flu.
Yes.
For example.
Yes.
So the winter-summer flu it has a spatial component because they could track the flu coming in from Asia, spreading outwards in a wave, and also they could link the summer and winter thing to either people being inside more often and to colder temperatures allowing viruses to remain like on surfaces for longer, or to maintain a shell. So that adding in climate is probably the big one of the big questions, and where the field will probably go together. The reason I mentioned behavior is because often someone would like to, people would often, if you hear sometimes on news, well, I don't know how often they talk about it. They talk about mathematical models on news. They'll try to liken it to a weather prediction, right?
Right,
so,
right, like a forecast model.
Yeah, I'm going to forecast the number of infections next week, or the death toll next week will be this. And that's kind of similar. And it is similar in that respect, but it's not, because your behavior doesn't influence the weather. Like, if it's going to rain and you say, oh, we're not going to turn up beach that day, that's not going to stop it from raining.
Right.
Funny
right.
enough.
Yeah,
funny enough, I don't think that they ever do talk about it in terms of forecasting when we are given that kind of programming. I don't really hear anybody talking about we are expecting this number to, like, their main thing is trying to influence behavior by showing, okay, these figures right now, this is what's happening right now. This is bad. We have to take it down. They don't ever say, well, if we go along this route, we expect 1,000 more deaths by next week. They don't ever tend to say those things for some reason. Whatever that reason be, because maybe, I don't know. And a simple thing that I was thinking about, like, for anybody who mightn't be sure about the GIS, when they do show a map on the screen and they do plot, they always show the map and they show where in Cuba it had this outbreak and they show the red dots and thing. That in its simplest form is GIS. Would you say so? Well, let's say that. So that is a form of GIS, But, speaking about all this and, linking it back to how you brought up about what do they talk about when, if they like a weather report or whatever, you see that, when you talk about spatially different areas and the different data coming out of different areas and what is happening, cultures would have to play a part now in how so like an area that may be the hub for the science, may be fed and impacted by a culture which is very far removed from another place which is also affected. And when we try to translate certain things across, there may be that where people might say, well, listen, well, clearly this is making sense because of the fact that they don't take into account that there are certain assumptions being made that probably, don't relate.
Carnival.
Carnival, looking at things like testing, even governmental decisions. You know what I mean? Even like policies that are being put in place. So whereas you can look at the level of infection in one area, if we have a public now who is full of people who are infected but not tested, you are full. If you have a public now which they don't. What? Tell me, Kris, of like like on a real basic level, what role does the public play? What actions of the public besides getting infected and being a host? Right? What actions? Because we know that happening no matter what. That's what it's all about. The infection spreading. But then certain assumptions can be made, and then it mightn't really be that happening in our culture. What is are the other steps or the other actions that the public would have to take, generally speaking, that would be feeding into models? Like what? So testing, what else? Like being hospitalized.
Testing, compliance. Like if you have if you tell people to quarantine on return flight, what proportion of people are doing that? How many are just leaking out of the system, if you want to put it that way?
Right.
So that's a big deal. The two most popular ones are things like mask wearing / social distancing and vaccine uptake. And the vaccine uptake one is particularly famous now. Well, it's famous anyway, but it's particularly famous in other regimes, say measles, because countries like the UK and US didn't have measles for any kind of major outbreaks of measles for ages. And then the swinger anti-vax kind of culture led to some clusters of that popping up, popping rising again. So that's an example. I mean, it's a smaller example, but they have some behavioral things that you just really can't account for. Just to kind of give you an example of how strange epidemic could be. There was a case in Spain, I think, with hepatitis C, where they had 200 cases, right? They didn't know what was happening, and they used the data. It was the first time data was like this was used in court to convict someone. But anyway, so they used the data, they traced it back to one man, right? This one man was an anesthesiologist, I think. The person's administer anesthesia. What he was doing, he was working in a dental surgery or something. Yeah, he was taking. I'll hit himself before he would inject the patient, and he had so he was just transmitting, via the unclean use of those needles, so he could get a little high. I mean, it's right.
What? What do you mean he was taking? Wait. Explain again. He was taking a little up.
He take a shot.
Of what?
Whatever he had to give the people.
Yeah, whatever drugs he was giving the people to kind of,
So he was hitting up and then hitting them with syringe?
Yeah.
What are you telling me?
So check your tools, people. Check your tools.
He caused 200 infections or more.
Damn.
That's crazy.
No, when they say, let's just clear up something. When they say that he caused 200 infections, do we mean that how the results of his actions can be seen to have infected surely 200 people in terms of tracing it out? Or is it that his manual activity hit 200 people different?
I think his manual activity hit 200 people. Because it was over like a space of 10 years, before they caught him.
Right.
He caused like unexpected cluster of, so that no model could ever give it that. So
yeah. But then Kris, wouldn't you then say that because it comes back to the concept of how do you measure how good a model is? And we mentioned originally that it has to do with the model being realistic. That so a perfect model is one that gets the numbers right. All right, it gets the forecast right. But as Kota was mentioning, you're modeling. You start to model behaviors. So if I mention like Carnival, to me, how that will factor into our model is that you will say, well, Carnival could function as a sort of super spreader event where everybody congregating in this one place and going down certain streets. So you figure out wherever that track is at, and that will inform your model itself. But doesn't it have a limit to that? Like you could put too much factors in it and your modeling will be that good, because if you put, the speed at which a man winding down to the ground, you know what I mean, and you give a gyration factor and all kind of thing, well then the model goes, you understand what I'm saying? Yeah, that's right. The amount of deals on the road and this kind of thing, the model might become too complex now, Jed. You understand? So it have like a sweet spot.
No, so that point is exactly. So that was the point I was trying to bring up when I was asking about the geographical information systems and using mobile phone tracking and stuff. Is that you could get some headway, but we'll hit that point where you just have too many variables and you can't be, these things. If you put them in there, it could have hundreds of variables. It's very hard for you to cross check that and make sure that something didn't go wrong somewhere, or like, it's not my assumption more than the data informing on this part of the model, and so on. So that's like a huge problem. Yeah. And that's a huge problem also in artificial intelligence for the same reason. So these two areas are very linked in that respect. But if you go back to the different types of models, when you're saying like, with men gyrating in Carnival and stuff, if you're trying to model the spread of HIV or sexually transmitted infections, then knowing who is the big boy might be a useful thing to put in your model, because you'll get some type of structure, these guys might be more promiscuous than others. You want to have them in your model for a sexually transmitted infection, not for COVID because it's less relevant there. So it's kind of like you have to pick the relevant points if you want to put it in time.
Right.
But as I say, it's always a question, and this is not just models. It's almost like most things that we use, whether you're doing like financial time series or stocks, or if you're doing, engineering or any of these things, you have to make either an explicit or implicit trade-off between what you're willing to assume and what you think your data could tell you. and you sort of have to balance those two things. So like you can't go, if you want to go on it like to the most basic level, you can't go and say, I want to model how a ball rolls down a hill and I want to add in relativity into that to help me work out the correction of speed relative to that. Because that's like a nonsense, that's not a relevant point to that model. Do it. Nothing stopping you from doing it. It will be theoretically more accurate. It won't actually be more useful in reality. So that's
like if you're modeling a gyration and whether you're gyrating anti-clockwise or clockwise, it ain't gonna really affect the spread.
It won't affect the spread,
I hear you.
Yeah, well, Carnival have plenty complicated models on the road. So any major, so let's take some questions from the viewers now. We have Rajiv Ramsrup here. Any major differences in parameters or variables in modeling spread in a first world country versus a third world country? I think that's something that definitely is there.
As a tough one, there's differences in the data quality for sure, and that tends to feed back into the parameters. That tends to feed back into the parameters that you would fit. So that could account for some of the variable patterns, but mostly the variability might come down to the broader point Qatar and Leslie and Torin were making about different behaviors and different cultures, having an influence. So, for example, with Ebola, well, Ebola didn't really make it into the West, right? But if it had made it into the West, it wouldn't be modeled in quite the same way as how it was modeled in Africa, because in Africa, one of the ways it was spreading was that they had a type of funeral ceremony where they would be in a lot of contact with the body or with the fluids from the body. And there was infection from that. That was a major.
From that, I remember that.
Yeah.
From their burial rituals.
Yeah, exactly. In the West, they're like, well, no, I'm not touching that. So they're safe from that respect. So,
right.
Makes sense.
Now, next up, we have Nigel Das. What is causing the cases to decrease in the UK despite opening back? Is it related to the percentage of people vaccinated, or is it due to less people being tested? Is it a combination of both?
Oh, that's an open question at the moment. Some people even believe that that's a false drop, and they're looking for like more official, because there's this other data source where they. So what that is like those are cases like confirmed via testing or whatever, right? But there's also another study that goes into the population and tests randomly to also get asymptomatics, for example. And other cases that wouldn't, because usually the cases that get tested are the cases that are more severe. Someone would think, I had COVID, or they know that they were in contact with someone with COVID, they'll get tested and they'll get registered. If you don't think that, or you think, well, I'm all good, you wouldn't necessarily get tested. So there's a lot of debate about that. I think it at the moment, the consensus seems to be a mixture of all three. So no good answers there, unfortunately.
Still up in the air, as many things are. Now we have Mr. Butch. I recently saw an article indicating that focusing vaccination on vulnerable first can lead to higher levels of vaccine escape, which seems counterintuitive. Why is this? And that's a very layered statement in my mind, because it contains vaccine escape and the vulnerable, and it being counterintuitive. Or maybe Kris, you could take a stab at it better than me.
I'll take a stab at parts, because some parts I don't think vaccine escape is sort of very complex. So I'll leave that to immunologists to be able to really describe it. What I would say is what they believe about vaccine escape is that if you hold a lot of infections in a country, no matter how you hold the number of infections, even if they're mild, if you have a lot of infections in a country with a lot of vaccinated people, you do offer the opportunity for the virus to evolve such that it could mutate, such that it might gain some advantages against the vaccine, because you sort of select for that means you kind of just cull the weaker bits of the virus, you sort of enhance. So that I don't know how good I explain that. That is how.
But very good point, though, Butch. Very. Like, I really didn't think about it from that.
Yeah, but let me touch on that, Cutter, because apparently that's a question that's circulating now on CNN, and what it is they're saying is that that argument of vaccinating the vulnerable first has to do with the query that coming up now, which is the booster vaccines, and whether they should focus on getting the boosters out there or vaccinating the main set of populations. And I could tell you out here in Micronesia, I am interested in getting the booster. The conversation is about getting the booster. Yet in Micronesia, we only have 50% vaccinated in terms of people getting their first shot. So right now, Biden and they actually caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of, do you take a policy decision to vaccinate the vulnerable first, which means we don't talk anything about boosters yet because we haven't gotten their entire cities that may have their own behavioral, whether Republican, Democrat, whatnot, for not getting vaccinated. And let's get that vulnerable vaccinated first before we have the discussion of boosters to people already vaccinated. So it's almost like a perspective of vaccine luxury kind of way then, know. Versus people who just need their full shot, So it's an interesting perspective that seems to be playing out in right now.
And I don't see what is going to be the breakthrough.
I want to add one point to what Leslie said. Is just that in terms of vaccine distribution in general, beyond the whole part about equality, which is another question, right? Even within our population, the question that always comes down is, do you vaccinate the more vulnerable or the person who's more likely to spread, because they may not be the same, And for COVID, the more vulnerable, the older people, per se, like we do by age, and the more likely to spread are the younger population.
Yeah, well,
right.
In Trinidad, it's us, and the wild men, the jungle men, right? Fawaz Khan asks, do models take into account any anomalies to the virus or help identify any? So is there anything with models that they would have to pay attention to any anomalies, or do these anomalies occur on a wide enough range to be taken into consideration or something like that?
So some of them, so a point we didn't really talk about was what are they, when you have a forecast from a model, how do you interpret it? So usually when they give you a forecast, they don't give you, some people in the, news might quote a single number, but usually they give you a range, particularly sometimes a big range, right? It's kind of like the tolerance, if you were to say buy, if you were to buy eggs from the grocery and you measure the size of all the eggs you get, and you keep a track of that, you'll find this sort of this variation, right? So if you wanted to tell somebody what's the size of an egg, you'll give them an average plus some degree of uncertainty, right? So a lot of these forecasts, they have these big uncertainty, large uncertainties. So for example, it could be, someone might say, I think in the UK, they're saying we could have between 50,000 and 100,000 new infections next week, say, right? That's a big range. Right? That is reflective of things we don't know about the epidemic, and some of the anomalies will be covered by that. Some of them will actually become apparent by not being covered by that, which was the case with the variants, because the current models just weren't fitting, what was happening with in fact, the best example of that, we forgot to touch on, is Manaus in Brazil, where they had a model where they had so many deaths, right, that they were pretty sure that most of their population was, immune, or they had hit a sort of natural herd immunity. And then all of a sudden, I think in January, February this year, they had a next huge wave. And this didn't fit any of the models. Because if you go back, I remember earlier on, you were asking about if models predict the infections coming down, right? Those models had reached that point for Manaus in Brazil, which is near the Amazon region. And then what happened is they did that anomaly in terms of what was going on versus what the model was suggesting, then prompted people to go in, do a lot more sequencing of what was going on. And that's something, again, because I said, resources wise, like doing a lot of sequencing tends to be more like a first world thing. But they got a lot of sequencing and they found, well, there was a new variant there as well that potentially might have been reinfecting quite a few people too.
Right.
So that's a good example.
Right. Well, we are approaching that hour and a half, or we have approached and passed the hour and a half mark. So that unfortunately brings us
Kris had a good bed.
Yeah, we really want to thank you, Kris, for making this time. We know it's 8 o'clock here, but it's not 8 o'clock by you. You know, it's way past certain people's bedtime. You know, because as you all would have known by now, Kris is in England, and it was a very enlightening talk. I think what comes out of this and that people should take from it, and if anybody is looking right now, you know, we have to understand the amount of work that has gone into the science behind the study of the epidemic, right? It is by no means 100% perfect in predicting everything, as we talked about, with the assumptions, cultures, behaviors, anomalies, as Fawaz brought up. And then my good friend Boo just say, if we're able to predict human behavior through data analysis to identify patterns, then does that mean that we that predictable as human beings? And it makes you wonder. And it does show that yes and no, because that's why there's that area there where we're not sure, because after all, we are dealing with dynamic, complex human beings everywhere all over the world. But at the end of the day, we are, to a certain degree, all part of the statistics. So you know, people say I am not a statistic, but you are a statistic at the end of the day as well, because that is how everything has progressed. When you look at it from the mathematical side of things, I think Leslie had to leave us at the mafia. The mafia was calling. I want to thank everyone. So you know, as I said just now, we still have a long way to go, and Kris will agree, Kris, that there's still so much that can be done and made better when it comes to the models, right? And it really comes down to how the entire society and the scientific community can work towards this goal. So thank you all for your comments, for your questions. Those of you who are on YouTube, you all had a nice show today. We had our brethren come in and he unleashed a lot of wonderful statements. I really appreciate it. Where whoever he is, you all big up on yourself. It was grand.
Compartmental models, cutter.
Yeah. I think, you know, that guy, we have to find that guy and bring him on the show.
We got to bring him on the show.
He seems to know a lot that needs to be discussed.
That's super spreader. That's super spreader.
Yeah. But that's super spreader. What you were saying.
Hey, you're on my way. We'll get to that next time.
We'll get to that next time.
All right, brothers. Take it easy, Kris. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, fellas.
Yeah, that's big up. All right.
Yeah, that's
Bless up.
All right, man.
Bless up.
Later.